Welcome to WitchLit, a place to talk about the craft of writing and writing the craft. I'm your host, Victoria Raschke, author, publisher, witch, and nosy Scorpio. You can support WitchLit and the serious book habit it requires at ko-fi.com/WitchLitPodcast. And you can be part of the show by sending in your own death, sex, religion, politics, money questions for our guests to victoria@witchlitpod.com. If you like what we're doing here, please subscribe and give us a rating or review wherever you listen to podcasts. It really does help other witches find the show. Here's to never getting to the bottom of our to-be-read piles. Drawing Down the Moon, Witches, Druids, Goddess Worshippers, and Other Pagans in America Today is a sociological study of contemporary paganism in the United States. First published in 1979 by Viking Press, it was later republished in a revised and expanded edition by Beacon Press in 1986, with third and fourth revised editions being brought out by Penguin Books in 1996 and then 2006, respectively. According to the New York Times, the book is credited with both documenting new religious impulses and being a catalyst for the panoply of practices now in existence, and helped popularize earth-based religions. Margot Adler was an American author, journalist, lecturer, Wiccan priestess, and New York correspondent for National Public Radio. Adler received a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from the University of California, Berkeley, and a master's degree from the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism in New York in 1970. Adler joined NPR in 1979 as a general assignment reporter after spending a year as an NPR freelance reporter covering New York City, and subsequently worked on a great many pieces dealing with subjects as diverse as the death penalty, the right to die movement, the response to the war in Kosovo, computer gaming, the drug ecstasy, geek culture, children and technology, and Pokemon. Adler wrote Drawing Down the Moon in 1979. The book is considered by some a watershed in American neopagan circles, as it provided the first comprehensive look at modern nature-based religions in the U.S. For many years, it was the only introductory work about American neopagan communities. Adler was a Wiccan priestess, an elder in the Covenant of the Goddess, and she also participated in the Unitarian Universalist faith community. In early 2011, Adler was diagnosed with endometrial cancer, which metastasized over the following 3 years. Adler died on July 28, 2014, at the age of 68. So we were discussing Drawing Down the Moon by Margot Adler today on the show, and thank you to Wikipedia for the blurb on the book and Adler's life. And to discuss it with me, Phoenix LeFae is joining us again. And since she's been on twice now, she gets to introduce herself.
Yay. Hi. I'm Phoenix LeFae. I'm a witch in Sonoma County, California. I run a little metaphysical shop. I am deeply involved in the reclaiming tradition of witchcraft. I'm a second degree Gardnerian, and just a general explorer of the mysteries.
Great. And thanks for coming back on and for
thanks for having me.
Reading this giant book to talk about it with me.
One of my goals this last year, I have all these older pagan books that I'm slowly slogging through. So this was a good excuse to get myself to read this one again, because it has been a long time since I read it.
Yeah. I read the 2006 edition. Is that the one that you read as well? Okay.
I listened to it. Mm-hmm. So I feel like, when I read a book, I have a stack of Post-its and I will mark all the amazing things or the things I hate or whatever. And so when I listen, I can't do that. So I went to find my paperback copy of it, and it's the 80s version.
Oh, wow.
So, okay. So I don't have a actual physical copy of the most recent version, but that is the one that I listened to.
Yeah, I half read the electronic version of the 2006 and took notes on my iPad, and then listened to the back half of it because I had 1,000 other things going on. But I don't know. Phoenix and I were talking beforehand, and when we've done nonfiction or we've done fiction books, we usually do the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I don't really feel like there's an ugly here. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting is I did read the book like in the early 90s. So that would have probably been either been the 70s or 80s revision that I read.
Yeah.
And I can't remember which one. I can't remember what cover it had and which edition it was. But I didn't remember it being this long, which I think is funny. And maybe it was just because I was in college and reading a giant book wasn't a big deal.
Sure.
But I do wonder if it is probably a little longer because she doesn't really take anything out. She mostly adds.
Yeah, she just added. Yeah.
Yeah. So two revisions later.
I tried. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot to update, right? And I tried to read it in the 90s and I couldn't. I had a really hard time getting into it. And now I think because I actually have context for a lot of what she writes about, it was much more interesting for me from this end of my experience level than at my beginning stages.
Yeah, I don't think, I mean, based on this read, like it was like reading a new book. Like it had been it's been 30 years since I read it. And like you said, contextually, I'm a totally different person than when I read it last time. So it felt like I hadn't really read it. Or at least it hadn't like sunk in or the connections weren't there because I didn't, like you said, I didn't have the experience or the context for any of these things. And boy, she does write like an NPR correspondent, which is kind of easy to read, but it was like, it's always funny when she steps into the personal because it's kind of jarring. So what were your
what's crazy is her book and Starhawk's The Spiral Dance came out on the same day in 1978, 79. I can't remember which year. But The Spiral Dance so intimately impacted my practice as a young witch. And this book did not. So it's just so interesting. Like these, and they, because they came out at the same time, they were really considered a big part of the movement of the 80s. Yeah. It's just interesting for me from my personal perspective. Like, it's like I have such a different perspective on witchcraft because I fell more into the Starhawk camp than the Adler camp,
Yeah. It's funny. I will make a confession on the podcast. I have read a lot of Starhawk's work. I have never read The Spiral Dance. So
that's funny.
I own a copy. I have an ebook copy and that I got like on BookPub. It was like one of the like 99-cent specials or something. I still haven't read it. I need to get on it. And so maybe I'll have to get someone on. So I have to read it. We'll have to talk about it.
There you go.
But I've read like a lot of her fiction, if not all of it, and a lot of, later books of hers, but I've never read Spiral Dance. So, I mean, it's like, I don't know that I fell into either camp.
Updating.
I mean, I think, it's funny. I had another interview today and we were discussing the fact that, it's easy to see like in the community, like the books that people recommend people read, like when they're new, like depending on where you are in the, boomer, X, millennial, like what you tell people to read. Yeah. And I don't know that I would have ever said, go read The Spiral Dance and Drawing Down the Moon. Like in the last 20 years, I don't think I would have recommended it to someone because I don't think it would have grabbed them the same way. Because especially this book, now I can't say that about Spiral Dance because now I've admitted I haven't never read it. But this feels so much more like a snapshot of the time that each of the revisions happened, that it's an introduction to what's out there, but it's not really an introduction to witchcraft.
No. And honestly, I don't even think it's really an introduction to what's out there anymore. Right. Like the 2006 edition, that's almost 20 years ago. You know what I mean? Like it needs another update. Unfortunately, Margot's passed away, but like so much has changed in the community since 2006. I don't even think it's the same community it was 20 years ago, which I think you could have said with every new edition of the book. Yeah. So I don't know that I would recommend this to someone new. I think I would recommend it more to someone who's like looking for some historical context, or how the system grew through the 80s and 90s, not necessarily like, it's not a how-to at all.
No.
Yeah.
No. And I think when I read it the first time, I was surprised because I think I was expecting a how-to, because the person who recommended it to me had been in witchcraft for a while. I was like, oh, you have to read this book. And I was like, oh, this will help me kind of figure out. I was still pretty new. And I was like, oh, no, this is not. This is not what this book is. But I think it's fascinating that in that last revision in 2006, you're really seeing the beginning of like internet culture really take off in paganism and how that's different. And, I did not come to witchcraft through the internet. I came through personal connections. And so it was interesting to read the section where she's talking about her initial introduction to witchcraft in the 70s and how that was like walking into a store, basically in New York. Right. Yeah. And now, like, I don't know how often that happens.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, it's a totally different experience. Yeah, I appreciated the moments of the book where you get glimpses into her personal journey, but it also sort of feels like it was it's like a highlight of her circle too. Like she mentions specific people over and over again, like Oberon Zell and Isaac Bonowitz, and and some of these people are we now know have some problematic behaviors in their past or whatever. But and like Z Budapest, like she focuses on these specific names over and over and over again, and it's almost like she focused on the circle she was running in, rather than like get a wider snapshot of what was going on. Yeah. And I think that's interesting too, because there is some things that are missed, I think, because she sort of gets really into specific people. And I guess that's being a journalist, right? Like that's the way you do it.
She talked to you and she knew. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I did think that part was interesting. Because I mean, even, like when I read it in the 90s, those people were kind of the top level names that you would know, like from books and conferences and things like that, you would know those people. But like I was just like, there's such a world that's unfolded since then. And like you said, there's things we know about some of those folks that, they haven't progressed with the times or problematic, however you want to look at that. Yeah. I think that part was interesting. And but I was just thinking about like, one of the things I really thought about it is like how different the experience would have been like in the 70s, 80s, early 90s before the internet really took off, that the door you found would have so influenced what your path would have been.
Yeah. 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 I mean, that was true for me in the 90s because, I read a Raymond Buckland book. I read the Starhawk book. I read a couple other books, but the local community that was doing things was a reclaiming community. They were the ones in this part of the world that were putting on public ritual. So that was my real like experiential introduction because that's who was here. I didn't meet a Gardnerian for at least a decade after I've been practicing, So I do think that the door you walk through is how it's like the lens you look at witchcraft through forever. It is really interesting. And I think that has changed because with the internet, you can almost like shop ahead and read about the different traditions and the different practices and the different ways of doing things. And you have access to a lot more information than you did in the 90s or the 80s. And especially before that, where it was even harder to find connections with people.
Yeah. I was thinking about like the first group I practiced with was at my university. And it was more like I'd say they were probably influenced by reclaiming, but they never said that. And I, in context, have kind of figured that out over time. I would say that's kind of the base. But when I first joined a coven, they were kind of inside a Unitarian Universalist church. So they were very influenced by like for the Queen of Heaven and
Yeah.
See Budapest. Like that was really, it was very women focused.
Yeah.
It was very Dianic. And I just kind of lost the connection, the thread there. I had a son, you know, I was like, this is not, and it hadn't quite progressed at that point, I guess. And I don't know where they are now. I've kind of not kept up with that. So, but no, I think it did influence. And like you said, now the idea of being able to shop, and the closest she gets to that in that book is that long section about all of the different groups that existed in that, in those moments. She captures the different revisions and
and even that's interesting because so I listened to a big chunk of the book when I was on a plane flying to Minnesota and flying back. So it is highly possible that I dozed a little bit. So I will admit that I may have dozed a little bit at certain spots, but I feel like she talked about Faria forever.
Yes.
And
that section sounded long. Yeah.
So long. And it doesn't seem like that community has had that great of an impact on the wider pagan and witchcraft movement. Like they're I don't even know that they're still around. Very small, located in Southern California. Like I was like, why is this section taking so long? As of 2023, I don't think they've really had a big impact on where we are now. You know, maybe that's a little judgmental of me, but besides her book, I don't know that I've never met anyone from that tradition. I've never been to a ritual put on by that tradition. So I just found that really interesting. Like, why this group? Why did you give this group so much exposure?
Yeah. And I don't know if it was because she talks about that quite a bit. She brings up the Temple of Aphrodite in New York several times, but not to the depth of Faria.
Right.
And I was like, I wonder if because these were older, like that they really were started in the 50s, if that was part of why she, you know, that she kind of saw them as bedrock. But like, I don't know that they really were. Like, you're right. Like outside of this book, like I don't like, and I've read a lot of books for the podcast in the last 2 years of new books, and it has never been mentioned.
No.
Is that an influence? I don't see it in bibliographies. Like it's not showing up anywhere. So I don't know if it was part of that milieu of like just like you said, like the group, the circle she traveled in, or if it just fascinated her. Like I wish I could ask her.
I know, right? Like, and so I run a little book club, and because to prepare for our chat, I also had our book club read this book.
Oh,
so I was
good double duty. Good double duty.
That's right. And we couldn't get over the fact of how much needs to be updated, you know, and we've already said that on our chat so far, but like, I would be fascinated to hear her thoughts on where we are now compared to her most updated revision of the book. Cause it's like, who now would she say is like an influential voice? And I also think it would be interesting because she is in the boomer generation. Like, is that going to be harder to connect into what the current voice is of the current vibe of our movement? Like, you know, would it be interesting and possible for a younger person in their early 20s maybe to take up the mantle of writing the next edition of this book? You know, it would be interesting to get a younger perspective on the movement. And it is specifically American, and there's not a lot that's specifically American when you read history of witchcraft. You know, like I read Triumph of the Moon by Ronald Hutton not that long ago, and it's very academic and very thick and dense, but it is fascinating in the history of witchcraft, but it's all in England.
Right.
And this Margot's book isn't necessarily academic like Professor Hutton's book is, but it feels like it's the American version of that book.
It is journalistic. I mean, I do think it is journalistic. Yeah. And I wonder who would be like, you're right. Who would write this book now? And I can't even imagine like it. I'm sure she missed things because America's a big place, or the US is a big place, but like, I can't even imagine tackling this now. Like even at the level she did, like there's just so much out there.
So much.
So many books have been published. So many traditions have come and gone, and I would say that thing that she comments on in the last revision about it's really moving away from a coven oriented practice. I would say that's even more true. I mean, most people I know are solitary practitioners. Yeah. So it would be really interesting to get a fresh take on it, but I don't even know how you'd start.
I don't know. I wouldn't even know who to task that to. Like maybe Thorn Mooney.
When she finishes her PhD, we'll put her up to it.
Yeah.
I'm sure if she's listening to this, she just cringed 1,000 times.
Yeah, I know. Somewhere she got a shiver.
I mean, I would love to see it. I would really be interested to see what the next take on this is, because it's just so much. Like you said, it's like light years between 2006 and now in the community. So what was your favorite part of the book? Like, what did you really walk away from this, either that you really loved or wasn't expected, or?
Yeah. So the story she tells that has stuck with me, I can't shake this story. I keep thinking, what if this happened to me? What would I do? She tells a story of going to England and going to an Alexandrian, being invited to an Alexandrian ritual. And when she arrives, like the person who's supposed to be hosting the ritual isn't there. And there's all of these men and there's one other woman, and her and this woman go and get undressed together. And then as they're like naked in the hallway, she comes to realize it's this young woman's initiation ritual. The high priestess of this group isn't present, and they expect her to lead the initiation. Like, she doesn't know any of these people. She's never been in Alexandrian ritual. She's only been in Gardnerian rituals, or maybe I'm reversing that. I apologize if I got that backwards. But I was just like, oh my God, what would I do if I was in that situation where I knew no one and they wanted me to perform an initiation ritual for a new person? I just can't shake that image in my head. Like, I can picture the house. I can picture the naked women in the hallway. I can picture all of it. And it just blows my mind. Like, what a different world. I can't imagine initiating someone I don't know. Like that, I just feel like that would never happen. Maybe it would happen, but in my head, I'm like, that would never happen now. But I guess it could. Maybe I'm naive.
I have to say that did stick with me. And I feel like that's where we get like the deepest glimpse of her as a person too, because she's so candid about like all the emotions she was going through when this was happening, including like feeling a little better about her body because that other woman was heavier than her. And I was like, oh, Margaret. But I get it. Like, she's human and she copped to it. So like, whatever. But I was like, okay, I can't even imagine walking into that situation. I think I would have just put my clothes on and left.
Yeah, absolutely. It felt like the most, the biggest peek into her as a practitioner. The rest of the book is like interviews and other people's experiences and her writing about these moments that she's had and the conversations that she's had. But this was actually her personal experience that she shared. And that to me was very fascinating. Like, I want to hear that. The interviews are great. And they, I'm a nerd and I want to know all the history of our traditions. And I'm very curious about the different people and the players and how we got to where we are. But I want to hear it through everyone's like personal experiences and how it impacted them and how they felt about it. And so that story was the biggest peek into her, which was cool. I did like that too. And I was just thinking, kind of this, if you were writing this book today, like, I don't know that people would be as open to having someone come like that after just, decades of like horrible Halloween stories. And she's kind of writing pre-satanic panic too originally, and I can't imagine. I am curious, maybe I'm wrong, but I just don't know that people would be as open to just having a stranger show up. I taught a class that ended last night, and one of the students in this group was like, so how do I find a coven? And I was like, ooh, that's not an easy question. It's not like there's a directory you can just look up. People, especially I feel now more than ever, covens are really hard to find.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there are learning circles, there are public rituals, there are conferences. But I think trying to find a group that is just letting in people, that's really hard to find. I don't,
Yeah.
you know, it's always been you got to know someone who knows someone, but I think it's even harder now than it's ever been, even though the information is more accessible than it's ever been, which is fascinating.
Yeah. Well, and I think about like with the, you know, demise of WitchFox, like I think that was kind of the last place that people could kind of go when people had open covens that you could in your, I mean, it was, you know, geographical, so you could find one in your area and all that stuff. And that, I mean, losing that resource has really, I think, taken a toll on that too.
I think so too.
Because where would you even advertise now? You're not just going to put it up on your Facebook page if you're smart.
Yeah, but even Facebook, like no one under 25, maybe even 30 is on Facebook. You know what I mean? So you're missing a whole demographic of seekers. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's a really weird time where information is so readily available and accessible, but the actual people to do that work with are harder to connect to.
Yeah.
It's weird.
Yeah, and it's weird. It's I don't know. It's not like it's secret. I mean, that's the thing. Like witchcraft is a secret. Yeah. Witch talk exists. Like people are pretty open about it in a lot of spaces, but they're not open about that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, and I'm curious too. Like, I think, you know, this book is, I mean, she was a Wiccan priestess and she does focus a lot on Wiccan traditions. And I think like, after kind of like maybe during and after that time of the last revision, there was kind of that like we're going to beat up on Wiccanism phase of the community.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people kind of stepped away or went, you know, different directions. And then now that's kind of come back too. I mean, that's kind of come full circle too. And people are like, oh no, you know, Wiccans don't think that their religion is ancient. Like they know.
Right.
It's like, you know, this is not, you're not telling them stuff they don't know kind of thing.
Yeah. No one's living in a cave.
Yeah. No, we've all figured that out. And, you know, a lot of like, I would say, you know, prominently published pagan and witchcraft authors are Wiccan.
Yeah.
Which has kind of always been true to some extent, I guess. And I don't.
Yeah, I think it has always been true.
Yeah.
I think if you look at people's bios, it'll say in there like, you know, Gardnerian or British traditional. It might not be their current thing, but it's definitely in the arsenal. You know what I mean? Yeah. I think it's pretty common. Yeah.
But I don't know. I'm curious to see what happens from here. Like, because I think there is kind of a community that's built around witch talk and things like that. It's diffuse, right? Like if TikTok goes away, what happens to it?
Right. Yeah. I'm not on TikTok at all. I'm not good with social media to begin with, but I, you know, hear the rumblings. Occasionally someone will get annoyed enough about something on Witch Talk that they will post it on Twitter and then I'll see it. But I think there will always be something, you know, like in the 70s, you went to an underground bookstore or a feminist bookshop or, you know, a coffee shop and saw a flyer. You know, there was one of my teachers who was an elder in the reclaiming tradition, Rosemary Dance, was actually really against publicizing our classes. She was like, you don't need to post it on the internet. You don't need to put it out there and have 1 million people sign up. When people are ready, they will find you. And she was very old school in that way of looking at it. And I think that that's probably always going to be the case. If you really want to find a group of people to work with, either you will find a group or you will start one. You know, that's kind of what I said to the class last night. Like, if you don't find a coven, then maybe it's your coven to start. You know, like if you want to work with people, start working with people. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, I don't know, I've recently done a ritual and have another one slated this week and with other people. And it had been years since I had been, you know, in a practicing group. And There is something very special about it and magical that,
There is.
like as much as I enjoyed, kind of my own personal practice, it is very different working with a group, and it is not something that you can capture by yourself.
It's true. It's true. And I'm, in my heart, I'm a solitary. And I think even when you're in a group, we're all still solitaries, like they're a huge part of our practices are our own personal practices. But the amount of spiritual growth I experienced getting involved in community was exponential compared to what I was doing on my own. There's just so much you get from a group. And I know that that's hard depending on where you are in the world. And, it can be really complicated, but it is very powerful and transformative. It's worth it if you can make it happen in your own practices.
Yeah. So what else from the book? I guess aside from her personality that comes through, what else really stuck with you from this read?
I found myself, because I am a angry feminist at heart, I found myself getting really annoyed at the voices that she was bringing forth. There were so many male voices. So many male voices. And it was like the one feminine voice was Z Budapest, who is like, yes, hugely important in the early days of witchcraft, and especially like more feminist goddess-centered witchcraft. But Z Budapest is not someone that I want all of the feminine voice to, she's not my spokesperson. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think that, I won't go down that road, but I was like, where weren't there more public women in the 70s and 80s that she could have interviewed or talked to or listed in this book? I was getting kind of irritated. Like, how many times is she going to quote Isaac Bonowitz? Like, yes, he was amazing, but cripes, wasn't there a woman she could have talked to on this topic? Well, and her being a woman, I was like even more incensed about it.
Yeah. And I kind of like, even it's funny to me, like that Z Budapest is the main, I think like you're right, the main woman that she quotes. And Starhawk was right there. Like she mentions her a few times, but there's not as much. I mean, really, there's not as much.
Right. Yeah. And they were both in the Bay Area of California too. So it's like, there was a huge witchcraft movement in the Bay Area. There were lots of groups that she could have potentially connected with or talked to, but she made the choices that she made. They're just, it's surprising to me. I would have expected more women to be featured.
Yeah. And I will invoke Thorn again, that, she's mentioned on her social media and in her YouTube videos that so much of who gets cited today is still men. Like, even though the majority of practitioners are women,
it's true.
It's still men that get cited and published.
Even if you look at conferences, if you look at the list of presenters at a conference, it's not 70% men, but if you look at the population of who's attending these conferences, it is still weighted towards men's voices. It's very frustrating. Yeah.
It's just disconcerting, I guess. And, I'm sure if anyone looked back through the episodes of my show, they will notice that I have made a massive effort not to do that. I don't know if they have. I don't know if anybody has, but like I've gone out of my way to make sure the majority of the people I have on the show are women or queer, trans, or, but non-binary people, because I feel like those are the voices we're not hearing from as much.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I mean, obviously people are publishing books because all these people I've had on and published a book, but, like you said, who's presenting at conferences, who gets cited in other people's works, and especially, I find it really interesting, especially when you step out of kind of Wicca, witchcraft, neopaganism into more like cunning folk, ceremonial magic, grimoire work. That it's, I mean, not to be crass, but it's a sausage fest.
It's true. And ceremonial magic has always been that way. Like, that doesn't surprise me. Like, that feels like it would be and I'm being very general speaking here, so I apologize. I recognize that I'm being overly general, but ceremonial magic has always felt like that was dominated by more masculine vibes. But folk magic, like that's like granny magic. It feels like we should have it feels like the dominating voice should be little old ladies. You know what I mean?
Right. And they're really not showing up in the publications.
No. So, no. They're too busy actually practicing to write
actually doing
books.
the work. Yeah. They're too busy doing the work to write a book about it. They're writing a book for themselves that they will give to somebody. Right. That's what's going on there.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right.
But it is funny to me. Like it's just it's the world. I mean, it's just, our microcosm is reflective of the larger macrocosm.
It's true.
And then it just is what it is. But I do like that I do think there are, especially lately, it feels like even the major pagan publishers are publishing a lot more women. They are publishing a lot more queer, trans, non-binary folks. Yeah. I mean, so we're just getting more of everything. I mean, that's not a bad thing, I guess. Although people seem to complain about that too.
Yeah, I mean, people will always find something to complain about. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. The other thing I found really interesting is the way she approaches sexuality. And it almost feels like we've kind of grown out of this overt sexuality in the craft. And I think it's still there. And I think most of the people I meet in pagan and witchy spaces are much more sex positive than the average person I meet in the world. Like, we're much more aware of owning our sexuality and accepting of sexuality and all of that. But it almost seems like some of these early groups were forming groups for the excuse of having orgies or being polyamorous when there really wasn't space for polyamory. Mm-hmm. And it seems like we've kind of grown out of that. Like, I don't go to events now, because I did, like, in the late 90s. Sometimes I would go to events a little bit nervous that it was going to turn into some sort of like sex fest, because that's not my vibe. I'm not looking for that in my life. And I don't feel that same thing when I go to events now. Like, I don't think that I need to be prepared to, like, oh, that event's not for me, or, oh, I'm going to make sure I don't go to that, closed ritual. That's not for me. I don't think that it's as overtly sexual as it once was. And there's a lot of that. And when she writes about some of these groups and some of the early days of their practices, there's a lot about different practices of sexuality that I think maybe we've just become more grown as a community. So it's not so, like, tantalizing. You know what I mean? Like, I don't even really know how to frame what I'm thinking. I just think it's more commonplace and less, I don't even know the right word. You know what I mean?
Did she say this in the book, or did I read this somewhere else? I have source amnesia so bad right now. Did she say something about high functioning pagans in the book?
She might have. That does sound familiar.
About being at a conference, kind of just what you said about being at a conference and realizing that it had changed and there were families, and someone had thrown around the word high functioning pagan. And I was like, okay. Yeah. I mean, so I guess that had started, and I think you're right. I think we've progressed a lot since then. And we've also, I mean, not all of it, but we've also called out some folks in our own camp too about, really inappropriate things that happened. And I mean, it doesn't always go well for the first person who makes the call still, which is a problem. No. But,
but again, that's like the macrocosm, microcosm again.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But I do feel like it does get addressed more.
Yeah.
And maybe that is part of that.
I think we're also more aware of power imbalance between leadership and practitioners under that leadership. Like, it might have not felt like such a power dynamic when witchcraft was in this modern witchcraft was more in its earlier days. But I think that we get it now, most of us, like, I understand that even though this person I'm sexually attracted to is consenting and an adult, and I'm consenting and an adult, the fact that I'm their high priestess still creates this power imbalance that isn't okay.
Yeah.
And I don't think people were as cognizant of that in the early days of the craft movement as they are now. Like, that power imbalance is something that is we have much more awareness of the impact of the damage that can cause.
I agree with you. And I do wonder, like, early on, I mean, I don't know. I was always pretty careful when I was younger, and thankfully I don't have any horror stories, which I know a lot of people do. But I mean, there was more than one time I left a situation because it felt like not only were they aware of that, but they were taking advantage of it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
You know, and it was real clear that this was skeevy walking in the door.
Totally.
So,
I mean, that's another bonus of the internet. Like you can call that shit out real quick. Where in the 90s, where were you going to go? Who, you know, what high council are you going to report that to? You know, there isn't one.
No,
I think now it's a lot easier to say, yeah.
Yeah, there was your local whisper network about the missing stair. Right. And now we're at least trying to address the missing stair, but it's still, you know, I still think unfortunately that's still true in some cases, but yeah, it's a lot easier to make that public real fast.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh yeah. That's a
generational thing too.
Yeah, I think so too. And I feel like, you know, especially people younger than us, millennials and Gen Z, like they're even more aware of that and way less willing to put up with that shit. So
absolutely. Yeah, which I really appreciate.
Mm-hmm. And from all sides. I mean, not just like male female dynamics. I mean, they talk about it in even just a much more enlightened way than I think we did. So
absolutely. Yeah, I agree with that completely. Yeah, it's a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Thank you all if you're listening. I don't know what my Gen Z
thank you,
millennial listenership is, but God, do we all appreciate y'all. Just so you know, us old folks are glad you're all right. So
yeah.
This is strange. It's strange every time I think about the fact that, I am like pushing the elder end of the scale. Very weird.
I just don't think about it. I'm going to be in denial for as long as possible.
I mean, it literally is a state of mind, right? It's a state of mind. So
totally.
But I do like the idea of, you know, tattooed band shirt, Doc Martin wearing, you know, elders. It just makes me happy.
Yeah.
So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, as I keep encroaching closer and closer to 50, the Golden Girls are often in my mind and how old they were in that show and how close to that age I am and how that does not make sense. Like they were old ladies. That's not 50.
Yeah, I was going to say Gen X 50, 55 looks way different than Golden Girls 50, 55.
Absolutely.
If your hair is blue, it's not that kind of blue.
Right. It's not that kind of blue. It's different blue.
Different blue. Yeah. Oh, I don't know. I'm really glad I read this now. Weirdly, because it's like touched so many other things I'm working on personally. I was just like, it really made me think about a lot in context of like where we've come from, where we're going. You know, what my own personal work looks like. Yeah. Honestly, I think I don't know if it softened my heart, you know, my little black Scorpio heart, but like, I just kind of was like, this had to be like incredibly hard. Like, I mean, I knew it was like even in the 90s for us, because we were, you know, kind of like right in the middle of the satanic panic or the end of it. And people were losing their minds about stuff. But, you know, when you really could like lose your job and your house and your kids, and I mean, it can still happen. I'm not saying it can't still happen, but you got a little bit more behind you. You have people like Selena Fox, who've done a lot of work, and she does mention her in the book. But again, I don't think she gets as much press in the book as maybe she should have for what she's done.
And I wish she did. Like someone needs to write a biography about Selena Fox, you know, like she is someone who really has done a lot for the modern pagan movement, and the organizations that she's involved with have really made some major changes in our government and in the way, like at the Lady Liberty League and all of these ways that pagans and witches have support, legal support. Like you can trace a lot of that right to Selena Fox. So I do wish that she would have been more than just a passing note in the book.
Yeah, I do think there's a lot that's coming of that. And and the thing I thought was interesting, I can't like think of names right now. I should have taken better notes, but there are people who are mentioned in passing now who are really big names, right? That were just kind of like in their nascent career kind of when this last revision happened. So I think it was pretty interesting. So if you like, who would you recommend read this book? I guess, like, who would you say needs to read this book now?
Yeah. So I think if you've been around for at least a decade and you're curious about some of the American history of witchcraft on this continent, this book's for you, right? Like, in my early days of practicing, I didn't really care about the historical context and where things originated from. But now that I'm 30 years in, like, I could nerd out on these topics forever. Like, I want to know who and why and how and what book did they read, So if you're finding yourself in that stage of your learning, this book's for you. And it does have a lot of really interesting information about people who are influential, and we might not recognize their influence anymore, but it's there. The threads of their magic are still in what we do.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a really good point, because she does talk about a lot of people who I think, between revisions were either, quite elderly or already gone by the time she writes the first book, into the revisions, and really kind of as those people died, like what got kept, what continued on from what they started. And like, I think, was it the Minoan Brotherhood, like Eddie Bukowski? Is that right?
Right. Yeah, that's right.
Like how influential he was in his short life, but kind of doesn't really get mentioned.
Yeah, that's true.
So I don't know. It's interesting stuff. And yeah, I agree with you. I think it is nerd paradise. So,
totally.
What else would you recommend? Go ahead.
This just popped into my head when you mentioned the Minoan Brotherhood. I loved reading about the radical fairies because I didn't realize how influential they were on my practice. Like, I wouldn't have traced some of my origins to the radical fairies because I've never even been to a radical fairy. Well, that's not true. I've been to one radical fairy event, but the radical fairies and reclaiming kind of grew up like as siblings, so there is a lot of crossover between the reclaiming tradition and the radical fairies. And I'm listening to the parts about the radical fairies and I'm like, oh my God, that's like my people. That sounds like my people. So that was pretty exciting to feel like the lineage of mine connected to this other group that I knew existed, but don't really have context for. Yeah. That was fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. All those, like you said, like the, kind of the web of things that came out of those and grew and changed. And I think, when she's writing, there's still the kind of geographical maps of like where things were and where they got to. And now these traditions are global in a lot of ways, but at the time they really were. It was the kind of like, this was the Bay Area West Coast thing that was going on, or I guess if Fairfaria was bigger than I don't understand about this in Southern California. And then there was, definitely the whole like New England, New York, that kind of whole like that, with Buckland bringing, Gardnerian Wiccan over and kind of doing his own thing when he got here with it. All that. Yeah. It's, none of us, I mean, these are our, I guess, ancestors of idea and spirit and practice. So it's good to know who those people are.
You know what, though? I don't really think that's changed. I think it's obviously things are more global and wider spread, but I do think there's still very much a locality to the flavor of those practices, Like, even in the reclaiming tradition, like there are pretty big groups in different spots around the United States and beyond that, but specifically around the United States. Like, the group from the Bay Area is very different than the group in Minnesota, but they all are reclaiming witches. You know what I mean? So I do think there's still a regionality to it. And that makes sense because at the end of the day, witches and pagans, like, we have relationship with where we are, and where we are is different. California is different than Minnesota, so it makes sense that our practices are different.
Yeah. Well, and you're right too. There's been this resurgence in like bioregional practice too, especially like in folk practice. And so I think that makes sense too.
Yeah.
We're not, we have grown up and we don't just steal stuff randomly from everywhere and pretend it's ours as much. I mean, it still happens, but as much. Yeah.
I know.
Yeah.
I keep joking about that. Like, long are the good old days where we could just steal stuff and pretend we made it up, or have some fantastical origin story of, a fairy initiating us or whatever. Like, long are those days of just the fantasy of it all. How sad.
The myth making days are past. Now we're doing the work.
Yes, yes.
So,
Yeah, like if I can't Google it and prove that actually happened, forget it.
yeah. But it is funny to me because I do think that, like religions who've been on the scene longer and get a pass on that crap. And like we have to defend ourselves all the time. Like, no,
totally.
No one's ever made me like Google like stuff from the Bible. Was it real? Yeah. I mean, I know that people like archaeologists and Christian archaeologists are trying to prove all those things all the time, but it's not the same. It's not. It is. There's not the burden of proof.
No one is telling you you can't prove the virgin birth. Like, no one has an expectation that you're not a real Christian unless you can prove that was an actual event.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Well, and I think, she brings this up in her, in a couple different places in the revision sections about that the first book really talks a lot about the burning times.
Right.
Like the first version of the book talks about the burning times. And she's like, yeah, that was wrong. It's like, yeah, it was, we'd actually kind of knew it was wrong already in the 70s. Like,
right.
It just was getting,
Yeah, it was just the devout Murrayites who didn't want to let go of Margaret Murray's writings because there is something so romantic about it. Yeah. And, there is an appeal of, and I know it's weird to say like millions of women being burned is romantic, but there is like a romanticism about this moment and this liberation of women and this power of coming forward for the goddess. Like there that speaks to you, especially when you come from an oppressed class of people. Yeah. Yeah, but it's not history. It's not real history.
Well, and I think about like watching the movie, the Canadian Broadcasting Company movie. I don't know, the documentary. Did you ever watch that?
The Burning Times?
The Burning Times, yeah.
I've never watched it.
It's like Lorena McKennitt music and, it's
right.
It's very of its time. And but it was like, well, it's the Canadian Broadcasting Company. This has to be real, right. And then you're like,
it's real.
Not real. So, which, I mean, I do think, Ronald Hutton, like you said, Professor Hutton, did a lot of that work in Triumph of the Moon. Yeah. And, citing a man, but, but he's cool. Yes. Yes, I think it takes some of the romanticism out of it, but the actual story is also pretty darn cool. Like these people just went like, no, I'm not going to be part of the whatever. And they did, they stole a bunch of stuff and remixed it and all that. But they also just kind of took their, just struck out on their own path. Right. In a way that's admirable too. Yeah. Despite them being, flawed humans like the rest of us. So.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, there is a human desire for us to have spiritual connection. And a lot of people in that timeline, even in the late 1800s, when there was that interest in the occult really started to rise, like we're culturally really hungry for the supernatural, the spiritual, the beyond the human experience, because we are so industrialized. And so it makes sense that we would seek that out in other cultures that still have it. Yeah. We're hungry for it. We but most of us, not everyone, but a lot of us have lost our indigenous traditions. And so there is a desire to find our way back to it. And we can't find our way back to indigenous traditions, but we can create new traditions that are able to feed us in those ways, So I get it. It makes sense to me. Like we long for those connections and we don't quite know how to find them.
Yeah. And I think she addresses that a little bit too in the last section, which I thought was really good. And, was already happening, obviously, when she did this last revision. But absolutely. What I would not give for like the 2023 update.
I know. Me too. It would be really fascinating.
Yeah. So anyone who's listening who needs a project, I got one for
exactly.
you. Yeah, no, that would be great. So is there anything else you want to say about Margot in this book?
I've met her a couple of times at PantheaCon, and she was just a very bright and generous human. She was very kind and sweet. And so, that also influences the way that I read it, because my personal, and I would never, we weren't even friends. We weren't even acquaintances. I just got to meet her, and she was very sweet and kind and down to earth. And that's not always how it goes with someone who's made a name for themselves in any community, so I really appreciate that. And I try to share that bit of information about her too when I talk about her books, because, you won't get the opportunity to meet her anymore. She's passed on. Yeah.
Well, it's nice that your experience of her is what I get reading the book about her.
Yeah.
I mean, there is a warmth to her writing about this, because she's in the community herself. It is not detached. So it is journalistic. She does step in and she does talk about her own experience in places. And it's nice that that's true of her as a person too. I did not get the opportunity to meet her, so I appreciate that information.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, Phoenix, thank you so much for doing this and taking the slog through this book and with everything else going on. And if people want to read it, the audiobook is very good. I mean, the audiobook version is great. But it's something you can just kind of pop into and out of, because the book is really compartmentalized by chapters. So if you just want to, do it in bites, you can also do that. But yeah, I would recommend it. Like you said, I agree with you. If you're at this place where you kind of want to know where things started and where they came from in the United States, this is really the book that lets you have that peek on that world. Yeah. So yeah, absolutely. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And we'll have to figure out another reason for you to come on, and I'll have to come up with a multiple guest jacket or pin or something. Yeah, it's fun to chat with you. Yeah, you too. WitchLit is a production of Thousand Volt Press. Our intro music is Cosmic Glow by Andrew Kay, and our outro music is Voices by Alexander Shanekar. Transcripts and all our previous episodes are available at witchlitpod.com, and you can follow us on Instagram at witchlitpod. Thanks for listening and for reading witchy.